Locke, congratulating her on having, quote, found the weakness of Monsieur Locke, and explaining that while he found much merit in this woman, that is Lady Masham, Monsieur Locke I found a little less philosophical than I would have believed. He concluded his remarks about Locke by saying that, quote, it appeared that according to him everything is corporeal, that matter is capable of thinking, and similar things that overthrow religion. And then he added that, quote, these gentlemen imagine that it is impossible to have a strong and sound mind without being of their opinion, which suggests that he intended to lump Newton and his followers together with Locke as threats to religion in general. In his next letter to Caroline of 3 August, he wrote that, quote, since Mademoiselle Poulnitz has told me that you have finished reading Monsieur Locke, I will be delighted to learn one day of your judgment about this, because his principles are very different from mine and they are more popular. Breaking her self-imposed silence, Caroline replied on 13 September 1715, saying that she finished Locke a long time ago. In light of the remarks that Leibniz had made about Locke in his letter of 10 May, it is not surprising that Caroline added that, quote, I confess to you that I do not like his philosophy at all, but she added that, quote, what I find very fine are the disputes with Bishop Stillingfleet, which exhibit a civility accompanied by very good reasons. Leibniz responded in an undated and hitherto unpublished letter that was almost certainly written at the end of September or the beginning of November 1715. It is significant because it is a letter that Leibniz wrote to Caroline immediately before the storied letter that officially began the correspondence with Clarke. In it, Leibniz takes Caroline's reference to the dispute between Locke and Stillingfleet as an occasion to renew his attack on Locke. I have the books exchanged between the Bishop of Worcester, Stillingfleet, and Monsieur Locke, he wrote. The latter defends himself there nicely enough, but at bottom there is nothing of great import to learn there. Monsieur Locke undermines the great truths of natural religion. Monsieur Stillingfleet perceived all the bad consequences of that, but the other had the skill to parry the blows and to get the last laugh. Leibniz then suggested that Locke's subversive philosophy was one reason why the need for an English translation of the Theodicy was so pressing. I had hoped, he wrote, that my Theodicy would be found a bit more sound in England if one day it were read in English, and that it would furnish better principles than Locke. But I see that your Royal Highness, who gave me hope by being willing to consider it, has not yet found anyone suited to carrying it out. If it is still her intention, and if she made it known, I believe that not one of the better English writers would refuse her. It is understandable that Leibniz was becoming somewhat concerned about the fate of the Theodicy translation project, for Caroline had not mentioned it in her last letter, and in fact she had not mentioned it since first broaching the topic in her letter reporting that the Bishop of Bristol had found the Theodicy obscure, the letter to which Leibniz had responded 4.5 months earlier on 29 March. But now, for the first time, Leibniz was openly pressing for an English version of the Theodicy as a needful counterweight to bad English philosophy and to its corrosive effect upon natural religion in particular. It is true that only Locke is mentioned in the present letter, but in his next letter, which became the explosive first volley in the correspondence with Clarke, Leibniz would cast a much wider net of criticism, one that would include Newton by name, as well as nearly the whole of English philosophy. In the meantime, Caroline responded to Leibniz's remarks about the Theodicy project in a letter of 14 November 1715. Leibniz had been right to suspect that Caroline's earlier silence on the matter was due to a failure to find a fitting translator, for she wrote that, quote, I have spoken with the Bishop of Lincoln, William Wake, again today in favor of the translation of your Theodicy. He assures me that there is no one capable of doing it but Monsieur Clarke, some of whose books I sent you by way of Irnhausen. This same man is a friend of Chevalier Newton, and I do not believe the matter is in very good hands. Having been put off by the Bishop of Bristol's charge that the Theodicy was obscure, Caroline had turned to the Bishop of Lincoln for help with the translation project. Her letter indicates that she had spoken to him more than once about the project, and so she had obviously been actively pursuing it despite her silence on the matter. But having been forewarned by Leibniz about his dispute with Newton, Caroline realized that Clarke was probably not the best man for the job, despite what her friend, the Bishop of Lincoln, had told her, and she wrote to Leibniz accordingly. And this brings us finally to Leibniz's famous letter of late November 1715, the one that provoked the correspondence with Clarke. Of course, it is not the letter itself that is famous, but rather the short extract from it that was published by Clarke as Monsieur Leibniz's first paper. The draft of the letter itself has never been published in its entirety, and that has contributed to a general failure to appreciate the role that Caroline and the Theodicy Translation Project played in the run-up to the letter and to the subsequent development of the correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke. It is perhaps surprising that despite Caroline's warning about Clarke, Leibniz replied graciously and was at least initially perfectly willing to consider Clarke as a suitable translator. "Since your Royal Highness wants my Theodicy to be translated into English," he wrote, "it is as good as done. And I would deem Monsieur Clarke, if he wanted to be charged with it, and if he had sufficient mastery of French for this, an honorable enough man to acquit himself of it as he ought, friend though he might be of my adversary." But facing the reality of the situation, he continued by admitting that Clarke will apparently not think of it, and the Bishop of Lincoln, it seems, will not make himself think of it without an express order. If the need arose, there would be no lack of men who would acquit themselves of it very well. I dare say there is a bit of a need for it in England, for natural religion itself declines precipitously there. The last sentence quoted is, of course, the first sentence of the extract that was printed by Clarke as Monsieur Leibniz's first paper. And what follows is Leibniz's crushing indictment of British philosophy, invoking four particulars. First, that many suppose the soul, and some even God himself, to be material. That Locke and his followers at least question whether or not souls are corporeal and naturally perishable. Third, that Newton holds that space is God's sense organ, from which it follows that things, quote, are not entirely dependent on him and were not produced by him. And fourth, that the Newtonians suppose that God made an imperfect world that requires miraculous fixing from time to time, which implies that God himself is imperfect. Each of these charges was designed to discredit the English philosophers, and especially Newton, in the eyes of Caroline, and at the same time to impress upon her the urgency of the Theodicy Translation Project. And of course it worked. Caroline was now, as never before, incensed enough to call Clarke to account, to show him Leibniz's indictment, and to demand a response. She answered Leibniz's letter on 6 December 1715, sending Clarke's response to Leibniz along with her own letter. She asked Leibniz to give her his opinion of the works of Clarke, in whom she declared that she did not find the Theodicy, and then she continued with scarcely disguised agitation and excitement. "We are thinking seriously of having your Theodicy translated, but we are seeking a good translator. Dr. Clarke is too much opposed to your views to do it without reply. He would be most suitable of all. He is too much of the opinion of Sir Isaac Newton, and I am myself in dispute with him. I implore your help. He gilds the pill and does not quite want to admit that Monsieur Newton holds the views that you attribute to him. But in fact, you will see from the paper joined herewith that it comes to the same thing. I can only ever believe that which is suitable to the perfection of God. I find it much more perfect in your view than that of Monsieur Newton, where God must in fact always be present in order to mend the machine because he could not do it from the beginning. Neither Dr. Clarke nor Newton wants to claim to be of the sect of Monsieur Clarke, but I neither can nor want to be of theirs. They have a different notion of the soul. They say that they do not believe, but that God can destroy the soul, as you will also see here. I have a completely different opinion, and I'm going to skip down to the end. Please respond to the paper and show me my errors, which I would abandon with great pleasure and great respect for a man of the merit of the great Monsieur Leibniz." When Clarke wrote his response to Leibniz's indictment of the English philosophers and Caroline passed it on to Leibniz, the correspondence was officially underway. 6 months later, on 7 June 1716, Leibniz informed Johann Bernoulli of his ongoing dispute with Clarke, suggesting somewhat disingenuously that, quote, I had casually written Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, who on account of her fine intellect is not uninterested in these matters, that philosophy, or rather natural theology, declines somewhat in England. But Leibniz's attack on the English philosophers, coming as it did in the context of pressing Caroline on the matter of the Theodicy Translation Project, can scarcely be regarded as casual. It seems to have been a fairly deliberate attempt to alienate Caroline from the English philosophers, especially Newton, and to ensure her continuing loyalty to him and the Theodicy. Earlier, on 23 December 1715, a little more than 2 weeks after Caroline's letter to Leibniz describing her dispute with Clarke, Leibniz had written to Christian Wolff, saying that the Newtonians, quote, have also attacked my philosophical principles the better to persuade me to answer them. But here, too, they bit off more than they can chew. Her Highness, the Princess of Wales, who read my Theodicy with an attentive mind and was delighted with it, not long ago disputed in its favor with a certain Englishman in holy orders, having access to the court, as she herself informed me. She rejects what Newton and his followers maintain, that God repeatedly has need to correct and revivify his machine.